Yeah, from whenever we start. Are we all behind?
Hello.
Yeah, I don't know if we are all pushed back or what we're doing. Yeah, and more will come in. What is your position at the Rockefeller Foundation? Managing Director, Global Nutrition Security is what's on your thing. Okay, I just wanted to make sure. It sounds lofty and powerful, so I figured that's good enough. Right. I will say this, so we don't have to explain who Raj is, but everybody should know anyway, so. Good, thanks, yeah. Yeah, we're down. Still in Auburn? Still in Auburn with nice weather, so we're happy with that. Yeah, and then, oops. Yep. And yeah, kind of reestablished reinvigorating the reporting that had put on hold during COVID on the book that I was supposed to be doing back then. So we're going through that to spend all the travel money and spend down the grants that have been also in abeyance and extension from Gates. And so, yeah, so most of July was in Africa and Kenya and Uganda, and then next couple weeks we're going to go to India for several weeks. We're revisiting all the families in the First 1,000 Days book. So they're, yeah, I've got to sign books for the students who are here with the Global Teach Ag Network guys at Penn State. So they have about 40 people, so we just donate the books. So, yeah, so yeah, so I'll sign all them once this is over and then talk to them. Okay. Should we start, or I didn't know if how we're doing on time-wise or something, so. Okay. Yeah, they're gonna run a, hi, Angela, are you connected? Or we have a delay? Can she hear us?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. I can hear you.
Okay, so I think the deal with Angela is you can hear us, but you can't see us, right?
Right.
But we can see you. So be mindful of that, right?
Okay.
You won't be coming on. If you want to turn off, yeah, don't turn off your video. Just, yeah, be mindful that that we're seeing you. And so we'll addressly, we'll say, hey, Angela, when we throw things over to you. How's that? So, thank you all for coming. Welcome, everybody. We're still in our hybrid mode, as you can see, which is good, increases participation.
That sounds good. Hopefully.
Can you hear us, Angela?
Yes, I can.
Okay, good. We'll just proceed. So we'll start now. Yeah, we'll have 4 panelists here. Angela's on the big screen. And here in spirit, as well as galactical connection. But hey, thanks everybody for joining us. You selected wisely in coming here with the competing sessions that are here, so you're in the right place. So the theme of this year's Borlaug Dialogue, Feeding a Fragile World, is outrageously timely, as we all know and as we've been hearing from the previous sessions and everything that you'll be seeing, and what all brought you here. So Feeding a Fragile World. Outrageously timely, as is this panel, and our topic and our theme, integrating agriculture, nutrition, and climate for food systems. That obviously it all comes together and we need to consider as that. And so we've certainly seen a rapid escalation and expansion of the world's hungry and malnourished in recent years, approaching numbers that we thought we had put behind us, approaching the numbers of the food crisis of 2007, 2008, which prompted us to do all sorts of things on a number of fronts. But, you know, my goodness, here we are again, with the numbers escalating and expanding again. And so, yeah, it's undeniable. It's inescapable. We saw and we experienced how quickly the health crisis of COVID became a nutrition crisis. We saw and we are seeing how the impact of conflicts, no matter where they may be, ripple around the globe and have impacts far, far beyond the battlefields and wherever the conflict zones are. We see the impact of extreme weather all the time, every day in some part of the world. Somebody's being impacted by that, and how it impacts certainly the agriculture. You know, the harvest. Harvest time, you know, here now is driving up from Auburn, a long drive, but we're seeing people in Nebraska, South Dakota, and then here. Harvest time, see the dust flying in the fields, and so that was great, but then, yeah, the difficulties that the farmers had getting to this stage. And so seeing that conflict and the impacts all the time. So if we've learned anything in these recent years, it's that there is no over there anymore. Oh, that's happening over there. Oh, pity what's happening to those people over there. There is no over there anymore, particularly when we're talking about hunger and malnutrition. It's everywhere. It's in every single country. And the work that Lawrence and the Global Nutrition Report, and Lawrence will be up here, Lawrence Haddad, you know, have been doing, shows that this is a problem, hunger, malnutrition, the impacts of nutrition, of the various facets of it, is in every single country in the world. Here in the United States during COVID, if we didn't know this before, we certainly know it now. It's become more visceral to us than ever before. Hunger and malnutrition is in every single neighborhood in our country. Again, inescapable, undeniable. You know, in the US, diet-related disease accounts for over half of all deaths. That's also a global phenomenon. Globally, 45% of deaths of children under 5, lamentably, are still undernutrition-related. And of those children who survive, still, about 1 in every 4, 1 in every 5 are stunted in some manner, physically, cognitively. Stunting leaves them with a life sentence of underachievement and underperformance. Life sentence. I mean, just consider that. Consider all the squandered potential. Every lost chance of greatness for any one child out there because of childhood malnutrition and stunting becomes a lost chance of greatness for all of us. What are we doing to ourselves? 1 every 4? 22%, I guess, is the official number. You know, we've got to ask ourselves, what's wrong with us? Why do we tolerate this? And so we shall ask those questions with our panel today. So I'm joined by a group of people who don't tolerate this, who rise up in outrage and indignation over this, but also provide plenty of inspiration for us going forward, what we can do, what we should do, what is possible. And I'm sure all of you also don't tolerate this and are asking these same questions. That's what brings you here, brings you to this panel, brings you to the Borlaug Dialogue. So this morning we'll consider the task ahead. How do we reconcile humanity's two great imperatives moving forward? And in a lot of cases, if you think about it, these imperatives are colliding, and that collision is coming nearer every day. How do we both nourish the planet with ever-increasing population and an ever-increasing prosperity of that population, more people leaving extreme poverty, hooray, more people moving into the middle class, yay, but that increases the pressure and the strain on the global food system. So how do we nourish the planet, and at the same time, how do we preserve, protect, restore the planet from the consequences of those very acts, those agriculture acts of nourishing us? We all know that the toll it takes on our soils, our waters, our air, our biodiversity. And so we have a marvelous panel that will be addressing this, coming from all sorts of sectors. And so we'll have all that covered. One of the problems we'll hear, how all this has been siloed. Well, we're going to try to break that down now. And so our panelists include two Nobel Prize, two World Food Prize laureates. I've listened to Ken Quinn too often over the years, right? Yeah? Inevitable, right. He would like to see them as part of the thing. But so two World Food Prize laureates here. We have Catherine Bertini. Everybody will eventually be coming up here. You can come up now. So we can see each other as they're here. And we can sit in the order that you're walking very well. Very good. This is a help to our audio guys, so if we stay in this order. So we have Catherine Bertini, Managing Director, Global Nutrition Security at the Rockefeller Foundation. Of course, as we all know, or we should know, she served as the Executive Director of the World Food Program for 10 years, which then resulted in her, then in 2003, being awarded the World Food Prize laureate for, as they said, transforming the World Food Program into the largest and most responsive humanitarian organization in the world. I'm also proud to say she's my colleague at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, where she is a distinguished fellow of our Center on Global Food and Agriculture. Note the word distinguished. I am a senior fellow. Distinguished, she has accomplished many marvelous things in her career. I, on the other hand, as a senior fellow, what that means is I'm just old. And so that's that distinction. So, distinguished fellow. We have Lawrence Haddad, Executive Director of the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. Should be no stranger to any of us as well, and certainly not to this issue. He's the winner of the 2018 Nobel, there we go again, World Food Prize, together with David Nabarro. Both of them, particularly in Lawrence's case, for his leadership in bringing nutrition to a top global priority where it should be. And shame on us for all these years that it hasn't been, and kind of relegated to crumbs that were falling off the investment table. Then we have Tom Adams, co-founder, Chief Executive Officer of Pairwise, which he'll tell us all about. Tom Adams with an S. They dropped the S on his badge, so if you see him in the hallway, it is Adams. And Tom has over 25 years of leadership experience heading up biotechnology for global companies. Then we have Joe Puri. I got that right? There we go. Associate Vice President, Strategy and Knowledge Department for EFAD or IFAD, depending on your accent and where you come from. She leads the organization's strategy work in the key areas of agriculture, climate, gender, nutrition, youth, and social inclusion. And beaming in from Cornell, or are you in Chicago? Are you in Cornell? Is Angela Odom-Jiang.
I'm in Chicago today.
In Chicago, right. So
Packing to move to Cornell.
There you go, Packing for Cornell. Sounds like a book title or poem or something, Packing to Cornell. So she's associate vice president, associate professor, Division of Nutritional Sciences at Cornell, where she's off to. And she's also the director of the Food and Nutrition Education and Communities Program in the New York State Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program. So we'll begin with a call to action, which was summoned actually by Catherine in an opinion piece she authored with Earthring Cousin and Dan Glickman, two other distinguished fellows at the Chicago Council. In that piece, which was earlier this year, this spring, I think, Catherine and the others were writing about, so agriculture, nutrition, and climate change have been siloed for years in policy and in practice. Climate change, agriculture, and nutrition are inextricably linked, she points out. It is time for new investment and new approaches, and in a passionate call and summoning at the end, the potential for transformative, interdisciplinary, multi-sectoral action has never been greater. The stakes have never been higher. So, Catherine, brimming with this urgency, set the tone for us here. Why the urgency and what kind of new investments and approaches are needed, and what are we seeing?
Thanks very much, Roger, and hello, everyone, and thank you, Sarah, for organizing this event and Pairwise for hosting it. We've heard a lot already, even this morning, from Administrator Power. We've heard yesterday from Dr. Fowler. We're going to hear more from Cynthia, our laureate, about the urgency of these issues. I want to talk a little bit about kind of what they are and why they are where they are. We each feel passionately about the issues that we work on, whether it's climate change or nutrition or agriculture or anything else, but we have siloed all of these things. So we just talk about our thing and maybe tangentially some other thing, when in fact all of these are so much interacting. Just to give you a few examples, as we all know, COP up until now has not discussed agriculture, has not highlighted agriculture, does not, even with a lot of people kind of lobbying, hasn't really discussed the overall connection of agriculture and climate. Nutrition, if you excuse my language, I sometimes describe as the bastard stepchild of agriculture and health. And why do I say that? Both of these entities in any national government, or certainly in the UN context, agriculture and health, want to say that nutrition is theirs, and then they don't care for it. They don't do anything about it. And WHO a couple of years ago kind of downgraded the space that nutrition is sitting in. FAO talks about nutrition, but don't anybody else talk about nutrition because it's our responsibility, but then what are they doing about it? When we even think about that in the context of the US government, we can point to, well, where does it exist beyond some general guidelines and beyond the nutrition programs for poor Americans and school children. So it's focused, and it's everybody's but nobody's taking responsibility. And then agriculture itself, really, when we talk about agriculture, do we include the mission of agriculture in providing adequate nutrition? And do our governments, whether the US government or anybody else, consider the policies of agriculture as it relates to adequate nutrition? Do you subsidize programs, like vegetable programs, that might help nutrition when you subsidize other programs that aren't necessarily fitting in that box? It just does not yet compute because it's all siloed. So one thing I think we need to do is to work hard to forget the silos and talk about the interactivity in any kind of processing of these issues, whether in discussing them, writing about them, or actually creating policy for them. One thing that has become clear is that to the extent that we can include policy, when we create policy issues, we can include the voices of those in the communities who are impacted, we will be much better off. In Istanbul a few years ago at the Humanitarian Summit, there was a big concentration of discussion about community-based programming. Yet very few of the programs that we have, whether agriculture, health, nutrition, are actually community-based and actually come up from the views of and the activities of the people that live in any given community. And that's a really important part of our breaking down silos, because in communities, there aren't silos unless people are made to have silos, because people are dealing with real problems in real neighborhoods with real people, and those problems are all interacting. So that's, I think if we push ourselves to more community involvement and community participation, we're going to end up closing up some of these walls on the silos. I had hoped that one of the pluses that might have come out of the terrible tragedy that COVID caused all around the world was an identification of some of the nutrition-related problems caused by bad diets. And this is, I think, yet to be put high enough on any government's list. But when we think about the deaths from COVID that were exacerbated by the relative health of the people involved, and the fact that many of those people were impacted by their own poor diets, then we ought to be able to take that experience and push it into connecting nutrition and health in a much bigger way, and connecting from a policy perspective how important it is to work on adequate health outcomes for people in all neighborhoods and all situations, and not just talking about it, but doing something about it. I had hoped that we'd be able to say, this is the cost of some of the cost in country X of COVID in terms of the healthcare costs needed in order to provide assistance to those who didn't have adequate diets. And if only we spend a fraction of that cost on educating people on adequate diets and providing support toward the kinds of food that's going to help build adequate diets, we might be able to offset future problems and certainly build healthier communities. So those are the few thoughts, Roger, to begin with, and I'll have more as we go on if there's time.
Absolutely. Hopefully we will have. I'm going to bring my chair here and sit down. So all of you folks who've just come in, thank you. Welcome. There's plenty of seats in the front and scattered around if you also want to take this time to sit down, or we also appreciate the standing room only environment. But really, there's plenty of seats up here if you want to make yourselves comfortable. So please do that. I'm going to sit here because that's kind of awkward standing up there. Well, you guys are all sitting. Plus, it's more comfortable. Lawrence. Okay. So adding to the urgency that Catherine has been talking about and that she wrote about, that all of us feel, also all of us in this room. So GAIN, the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, brought us a new article last week, I think, or within the last 2 weeks, that was in Lancet Global Health, that reported that micronutrient deficiencies are an even larger problem than we thought. It was already like, oh my Lord, what? The problem that there was. So now they're reporting 1 in 2 preschool-aged children and 2 in 3 women, 2 of every 3 women of reproductive age worldwide are suffering from micronutrient deficiency in some manner. And so, Lawrence, kind of alarming on that front. What does that and kind of all the work that you've been doing in the past kind of spur you to do in terms of looking for new approaches, new initiatives? What are you focusing on at GAIN?
Thanks, Roger, and thanks everyone for coming. As Roger said, you made the right choice. I like that. I wanted to talk about 3 things that, as a nutrition-first organization, when you bring climate into the mix, what kind of issues does that raise? And I want GAIN to be one of the leaders in the nutrition climate space. We'll always be a nutrition organization, but I want us to be highly relevant on climate because climate is such an important issue, and I think it will help us be a better nutrition organization. And so the 3 things that kind of come up are, and maybe this will resonate with the rest of you, we're already doing a lot as a nutrition organization that I think can be classified as climate adaptive or emissions reducing, but we don't frame it that way. We don't talk about it that way. We're just doing it because it's good for nutrition. So the first question it raises, if you put a climate lens on it, on those activities, would you do them differently or would you do them at a different scale? So for example, we're already doing a lot of work on reducing seasonality. Seasonality is kind of a predictable cycle, not always a cycle that we could, that farmers and mothers and parents could mitigate that cycle, and incredible data from India published 10 years ago by the World Bank, showing that the month in which a kid is born, controlling for all the other observable factors like income, geography, education, determines their way to birth. Basically, if you're born in a certain month, you're malnourished at birth, much more likely to be malnourished at birth. Now we've got climate change making that variation even less predictable, and even with greater highs and greater lows in terms of food prices, input prices, temperatures, rainfall, you name it. So the question is then, if we're going to do food loss work, or if you're going to do work that helps, because food loss work is about smoothing food, or if you're going to work on food storage, or if you're going to work with small and medium enterprises to help them ride out the storms, these fluctuations, do you do that differently if you have a climate lens? I genuinely don't know the answer. That's what we're working on. Another example is we know that high CO2 levels are going to reduce, maybe already are, nutrient density levels in staple crops, right? So you will know about that. So what does that mean for the kind of work we do? Does that mean we go bigger on large-scale food fortification? Does it mean we produce more, we work harder to scale biofortified crops, which are higher in nutrients, to combat that? Does it mean that we work with the Rockefeller Foundation and others on this, on bringing whole grains back into the mix? Because the technology has changed, and we can bring whole grains back in. We can make them more stable, and they're great, right? We throw away all the good stuff when we refine the big three: wheat, maize, and rice. So that's the first class of questions. You know, what do we do differently? We could easily just say, yeah, we're climate sensitive. We're brilliant on climate because we're doing this, but we're not doing it in a way that's framed by the issue. We're just doing it because it's good for nutrition. Second question is around animal source foods and red meat in particular, because I'm really worried that when you bring the climate into the mix, you begin to interact very frequently with people who say, get rid of the red meat sector, or diminish it, cut it down, defund it, whatever you want to call it. And of course, that's highly problematic for some of the most vulnerable groups in society who basically, if they're lucky, survive on three meals of kind of gruel, thin cereal mix every day. And we desperately want them to get some animal source food because that's good for their nutrition. So again, we're thinking about what kind of because we're an implementing organization, informed by evidence, and we like to generate evidence as we go along, but effectively an implementing organization, what kinds of pilots can we develop with a view to scaling for animal source food production? And there are, even in the countries we work in Africa and Asia, we've sort of identified three groups of individuals. One group is they're consuming too much meat. What do I mean by that? They're way above their own country's food-based dietary guidelines. So for their own health, they probably should reduce meat consumption, and that probably will be good for, at least for emissions and other environmental dimensions. The second group is a group that's just on the cusp of taking off consumption. Consumption and production is going to go like this. So what do we do? Can we change that trajectory on the consumption side? Can we moderate it a bit? And more importantly, can we decouple it from emissions? Can we do that? And that's about technology and policy and institutions. And the third group is this group I mentioned at the beginning. We want them, they're consuming hardly any at all. And really, if any of you were in Kay Dewey's presentation this morning, you'll see that the nutrient demands of very young children are 9 times the demands for people like us in the room. So we desperately need to get bioavailable nutrients that are accessible and that don't require large quantities of food to be consumed for these very young children. So that's the second challenge. We are trying, how do you develop a set of pilot interventions that are going to address the nutrition issues while not exacerbating and hopefully improving the climate response? And the third issue, and then I'll stop, Roger, is around data. When COVID struck, when the lockdown struck in March 2020, I called up all my country directors again and said, what's going on with diets? What's happening? Because, you can imagine food systems grind to a halt. Foods that are high in nutrients tend to be more perishable. So you can imagine mountains of food, nourishing, highly nutritious, perishable food over here rotting away while families are trying to desperately get it. But they couldn't tell me what was going on. They couldn't tell me anything about what was going on with diets. 5 years ago, we started this project with Gallup Foundation and Harvard, Anna Herforth at Harvard, and GAIN. And we've now developed, the report's coming out this week, I think. It's called Measuring What the World Eats. And we've developed this new, it takes 5 minutes to administer this survey. It's a series of 30 yes-no questions. It's been validated against much more serious gold standard measures. It costs about 0.1% of what a normal survey costs, dietary survey costs. And it's good enough. It's good enough for monitoring. So now if something like that will happen again, now we, and hopefully you, because all of this is publicly available, will have the ability to measure what's being eaten very quickly. And I think that's very important in this era where climate is making everything so unpredictable. And so we have to get used to living with shocks. It's the new normal. So we need the data to come and go with that. So then the question becomes, well, how do we use the data in a climate world? How do we do that? So these are the 3 things we're grappling with. Don't have the answers, Roger, but the first step towards a solution is to acknowledge there is an issue.
Exactly. Thanks, Lawrence. And yeah, as you say, the first step is searching for the solution, and at least now putting our minds towards that. As a journalist, really appreciate the data gathering and all the reports that you guys have done, at GAIN and kind of in all the previous things that you've done and looking at this, and particularly that question of, the importance of the time of year that you're born. The harvest cycle and everything is fascinating. So we'll look forward to that. Tom, so the private sector, from startups to entrepreneurs to big multinationals and the global companies, have or should have a large role to play in all of this. So what kind of new approaches, initiatives are you focusing on at Pairwise?
Thanks, Roger. And I'll also thank Sarah for organizing this. I know she put a lot of work into it.
Thank you,
really
Sarah. Sorry for
appreciate you putting this together. Interesting group of people and interesting topic because it covers such a broad range of things. I was trying to think about exactly how I fit in because I come here as I'm a simple geneticist and we're talking about all these complexities of food. And it does come back to, I guess this all started with a simple geneticist with Norman Borlaug too. So I think that's a good company to be in. And genetics has certainly made a big difference in how we produce food. So I think I can answer the question. I think there's a lot of different places the private sector fits in, but I'm going to answer it from the perspective of people really from the genetic side.
Please.
I think, the challenge that I see, and I've heard a couple of people talk about this, is there's really 2 worlds. There's one world where we don't have enough food and another world where we have so much food that we eat too much. And in the United States, we have, I think, over 40% of people that are clinically obese and many health problems associated with that, and continues to be a big problem that's a challenge for our system. So you have 2 different issues. And then on top of that, we look at the improvements that we can make in crops, and there's a tendency to invest in producing crops that are grown in very large quantities and fed to pigs and cows and chickens and cars and not to people. So they do help to provide meat, but they're providing meat mostly in the rich countries and not in the poorer countries. So it's really exacerbating this problem of too much food and not necessarily helping elsewhere. So what we've looked at Pairwise is how can we help people eat more fruits and vegetables and the nutrition component of that. And I think if you start, there's a number of things that if we ate more fruits and vegetables that really have a big impact. First, it does have an impact if we all ate the plate that the USDA recommends instead of the plate that we do eat. That has a pretty big shift in the climate impact of agriculture. We're working on understanding exactly what that shift is, but it's a lot less meat, probably about the same amount of greens, a lot more fresh vegetables than we eat today. So a lot of opportunity there, and that's, I think, a big impact, which would also then play through to a health impact, because people will be healthier if they're eating more nutritious, more balanced diets. And so we've started with looking at, what are the barriers and what are the examples of things that have helped to drive consumption of fruits and vegetables. And there's a couple of different things that we've seen in the past. So breeding programs that have made things more available all year round. So blueberries are a great example, where breeding of blueberries over 60 years resulted in blueberries now that you can buy here any day in the supermarket. And I don't know about everyone else, but I know I eat a lot more blueberries than I did 15 years ago when they weren't available every day, because they've gotten incorporated into my diet. Easy peel mandarins. Simple, easy, transportable, convenient, fits into your life. And those, we think, it feels like they've been around forever. They actually came out of the market in 2013. So it's been less than 10 years since we've had easy peel mandarins. Turned the citrus industry from a sinking industry to actually a growing industry again. And I think is the #1 kids snack in North America and other parts of the world as well. There's other examples like that as well. So we've tried to take that approach of looking for both how can we make nutrition more available to people and make more products that fit into a convenient lifestyle. So we've got some big dreams that take a while in some of the tree spaces that would be similar to the easy peel mandarins. We want to make a cherry without a pit. Takes a while to do that. But not only that, and the convenience or the climate impact of growing crops, all the cherries in the United States essentially come from Western Washington. So you've got a real big risk of years that it's not cold enough in the winter, it rains in the summer, they all split, and then you don't have any cherries. So you can lose your crop 3 years out of 5. We want to make cherries into bushes like blueberries, which the genetics has understood how you could do that. So you could put them under plastic hoop houses like they do blueberries, and you could grow them a lot more places and spread them out and really change the risk. So that's a longer term project. It takes a lot of work. What we could do right away is we've made a new type of leafy green that's more nutritious than the greens that we eat today. So generally people talk about eating kale, but that's about 2% of the leafy greens that are eaten fresh in this market. The rest is, there's a little bit of spinach mixed in, and then a lot of romaine and iceberg, which are really fiber, but not a lot of nutritional content. So one of our scientists recognized there are relatives of kale that have beautiful leaves. Lots of different shapes, just as much variety as you see in the lettuces. The problem is they taste like horseradish, and that's the mustard greens. And a little bit of them in a salad can be kind of nice, but if you ate a whole salad of it, it's not so good. So we use the modern genetic technologies that have been developed of gene editing, and using the CRISPR technology, we're able to remove the enzyme. It's a single enzyme that causes that horseradish flavor. It's interesting science. If you want to talk about it, happy to talk to you about it. But we've removed that and now made a whole bunch of different greens that can be mixed together in beautiful salads that we plan to launch on the market next year. It's sort of a new category of salads, double the nutrition of the typical salads that people are eating, and taste good and good variety. So that's, I think, the type of approach we're taking to try to address these problems. Obviously, there's so many more complicated problems as well, and we are working with some of the bigger seed companies on the big acre crops as well to try to help to drive productivity and climate resilience there as well.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks, Tom. Fascinating stuff. So pitless cherries, I think, are an idea whose time has come, right? Like seedless watermelons, right?
Yeah.
Or other things. And the mandarins are a good example. Good, so thanks to that. And so, Joe, so kind of all these factors that we're talking about, agriculture, climate change, nutrition, they all come together in what you guys do, particularly your work with smallholder farmers. But as Tom was talking about the work of the private sector, you also do a lot of work with them and how important that is. So kind of what's going on with you guys.
Thank you so much, Roger. So maybe I start with 3 tiny stories. And
we love stories, so
yeah,
please.
I like them too. So the first story is many incarnations ago, I was looking at the climate change literature and what we found about mortality that was not difficult to find. But one of the key papers that really struck a chord in my heart was a paper that was coming out of Philippines, where they're looking at the impacts of typhoons on mortality. So, a lot of countries do that. But what was interesting was that the authorities in the Philippines kept looking at the data even after the typhoon had occurred. And they found that a year later, the mortality rates for girl children was far higher, 15% higher than for boy children. And that is because after an exogenous shock, such as a climate shock is felt, households change their intra-household allocation in favor of boy children and neglect girl children, and that then leads to an increase in mortality for girls, right? So that's the first story. The second story I want to tell is of India. Lawrence referred to an example in India, but last year, and I wrote an editorial about this as well, so India collects these national sample survey data rounds, right? So they're repeated cross-section data. But what they found was that for the first time, Indian men were getting shorter in height. And there's been a lot of confusion. There was a lot of attention paid to this phenomenon. But one of the key things that was found that could be a possible causal factor, and this is still being investigated, is of course the environment and the nutrition intake of a lot of the male adults and female adults, but female adults are already starting from a lower base. But for male adults, that this is changing and also interacting with the environmental conditions that they're having to deal with in big cities. So that's the second story. And the third story I want to tell is of EFAD. So like you said, in EFAD, environment, climate, gender, nutrition, food production all comes together. In fact, I'm really privileged to be leading a department where everyone comes together. And Catherine, to your point, yes, these are siloed, but it's exactly why we've organized, at least my department, which leads on everything technical, in a way that you have to interact together. So every investment requires a project design team where all 5 sectors have to be represented, right? So we came out with our impact assessment work just a month and a half ago. Impact assessments have counterfactuals developed so we can understand the extent to which we've been causal, right? The extent to which EFAD investments have really caused the impact on the ground and what would have not happened had EFAD investments not taken place. So that's the counterfactual argument. What did we find? We found that, okay, overall economic mobility, we were increasing it with our investments far more than we had thought, by more than 20% amongst our target group. Income, resilience, they were all going up. The one thing that was not going up, surprise, surprise, was nutrition. So resilience to climate factors definitely increasing, to economic factors was also increasing. Economic income and economic mobility was increasing and really well measured with statistics and everything put in there. We were causally measuring it, but nutrition is not going up. And this is despite the fact that our investments are meant to be nutrition sensitive, right? And so we looked at some of the underlying indicators, household dietary diversity, food expenditure, and to understand, well, what could be a driving factor. Now, food expenditure is going up as well, but dietary diversity is not. And for us, that's a really important characteristic of behavior change. And I think that's the last mile that we've got to try and address. And EFAD works, it's got an $8 billion portfolio. We work in developing countries. But clearly, for these integrated programs, when we are looking at nutrition, and we are thinking of resilience, and resilience to climate, resilience to economic factors, price increases, et cetera, we've got to start to think about what matters in the last mile and how we can bring about that behavior change. So with that tantalizing cliffhanger, back to you.
Thank you. And we had talked about this before. We'll hopefully get more into this of the smallholder farmers that you guys are working with and that are on the front lines of this, kind of the inspiration and initiatives that they're kind of leading and what we can all learn from them because they're at the nexus of this whole colliding challenges of these imperatives that we have. I'm sliding forward. I don't mean to ignore you or have you see the back of me. Angela, hey, still beaming in. Thanks for your patience. Hey, Joe just talked about kind of behavior aspects, and I know that's one of the things that you're looking at. And certainly central to all of this, and these questions of both agriculture, nutrition, climate change, the solutions to all of this, one thing that we can't forget, and it has to be central to all of this, are the issues of equity and justice, and promoting equity and justice. And your research, no matter where you're located, has been exploring the social and structural determinants of dietary behaviors and related health outcomes in low-income populations, and particularly among the Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And you were at the recent White House conference on hunger, nutrition, and health. And how the U.S. is grappling with all these things. What needs to be done on closing this equity, justice, racial gaps to bring food and nutrition security to all? And kind of what are universities doing in leading on this?
Thank you so much. And hopefully you can hear me clearly.
Yes.
Thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate it. And it's an honor to be on the panel. As several panelists mentioned, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Okay, I just wanted to make sure. I heard it go silent. I think the White House conference is a prime example about what can happen when you bring multiple partners to the table. As you mentioned, in some way we work in silos, probably for the last almost 30 years now. I've been working collaboratively with communities to think about how do you improve health outcomes through improving diet, but particularly with a focus on community capacity building. It's surprising in the US that we still have issues around the need to improve access, to improve affordability. When we talk about equity, of course, the most disadvantaged populations becomes those that are minoritized. So people of color, we also have a geography when you look at rural versus urban populations. And so part of that strategy means everybody coming to the table and really playing their role, whether you talk about agriculture or industry, government. And the White House conference, which had not happened for 50 years, when 50 years ago, a lot of the programs that we know today were developed. This next iteration has the potential to really change some of those policies, as well as create public and private partnerships to address some of these issues with a key lens on equity. Much of my work has been also around looking at community indicators. Some people talk about food deserts. We don't use that term. We like the term that communities use. They use food apartheid, food access discrimination. So when you look at communities where you have a lack of food retail in those communities, particularly those that lack access to transportation, lack access to jobs in a living wage employment. So some of the efforts that were included in the White House conference were really key to explain what we have, earned income tax credit, ensure that we have school meals for all, enhancing summer meals through electronic benefits transfer, aligning the healthcare system and the nutrition or aligning nutrition within the healthcare system, which we traditionally have not had, which can be strategies to improve in access. And a lot of our programs, including our nutrition education programs, in more recent years have had a shift. I was on the Institute of Medicine, former Institute of Medicine, NASM committees for looking at revised guidelines within the WIC food package, nutrition standards within school meals and school breakfast. And how do we really align those programs with the dietary guidelines and make sure that fruits and vegetables are provided in adequate quantities for people to be able to meet those recommendations. We know also people of color are disproportionately impacted by climate change. Those that have low SES are disproportionately impacted by climate change as well. So as was mentioned by previous panelists, we need to ensure that people within communities and that folks that are really disproportionately impacted are at the center of the solutions. We can develop everything that we want to develop, but if we don't hear the voices of people with the lived experience and make sure that they're in leadership of these solutions, we really are not going to come up with viable programs unless we make sure that they're aligned with people's beliefs, people's cultural values, and really build capacity from the ground up.
Yeah, hey, thanks for all that, Angela, and for reminding us of all those things and the importance of listening to people and hearing all these voices that we so often, don't even know are out there or don't care about listening to. I think one of the great things in the lead up to the White House conference was that there was this whole movement of listening sessions that went into that. We had a number at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. A couple of my colleagues are here that were participating in them. We did a particularly fascinating one in Selma, Alabama, where, particularly the communities that you were just mentioning about are so often sidelined and not listened to at all. So that was important. And thanks for reminding us that it was more than 50 years or so between White House conferences on nutrition, which always has me prompting, hey, so what took us so long to do that? And, well, what else were we talking about if we're not talking about nutrition and food insecurity and hunger in this country? And Catherine alluded to that as well, of kind of the negligence of nutrition through all of this. So love to get to your questions. I have a number for the panelists, but does anybody have any burning questions that you wanted to kind of jump up and shout about or ask us? Or as you think about that, I wanted to get back to kind of what Joe teased us with, and particularly kind of the examples and what we're learning from smallholder farmers. I think everybody up here has experience with them. So Angela, in the communities that you're working with, Catherine from your years at the World Food Program and all the great work that you did, Lawrence and Tom, the farmers that you then have to work with that are actually growing the crops then. And Joe, so what are we learning from like the farmers themselves and the smallholder farmers in particular?
Thanks very much for that, Roger. So I think what we are finding is that farmers themselves are actually quite innovative. Mm-hmm. I think COVID is also teaching us a few things about farmers. One, that farmers that tended to work within their own value chains that were local were far more resilient compared to farmers that were plugged into and were dependent on global value chains that were disrupted as a consequence of COVID. Part of that then means that clearly we need to invest in local as well as in regional markets, because that also means that we can then build resilient communities. It does not mean that international trade is not a good thing. It is. I think the pendulum has swung too much to the other side, and we know that that's there to stay. eBay is here to stay. But it's really important that we don't neglect. This is not a zero-sum game, and we need to see that the size of the cake will increase concomitantly as we start to focus also on local markets. So that's one. I think indigenous knowledge systems are clearly key. In several of our projects, what we did find that there has been, or our investments, there has been a movement towards, for cash crop purposes, there was a movement towards a focus on income. But it is this renewed focus on climate and on nutrition, which also pulls us back to thinking far more about subsistence and about the consequences for nutrition. And the important takeaway for us is that not only do we have to talk to the ministries of finance, which have to repay a lot of the loans that IFAD provides, but also have to ensure that we are speaking to the ministries of health, because they are the ones who are going to be far more concerned about the nutritional consequences of monocultures, of cash cropping, which usually get neglected if you're only focused on the markets. So it's really important to be thinking about that. And third is, I think, what really hit home for me is that while we think about local markets and we think about structured finance and think about, for example, resilience bonds, and I'm happy to talk about it, or think about paying for performance in terms of nutritional outcomes and resilience outcomes, we also need to call to action some of the largest food companies of the world. In a World Benchmarking Alliance report that came out very recently, and that I was advising on, they looked at the largest 350 food agencies of the world. And they basically found that most of these food firms, so these are profit-making firms, including Diageo and Del Monte and Carrefour, etc. But you can look at the entire list. But what they found was that they were very neglectful of the nutritional consequences of the foods that were being put out. Almost, I think only 14 or 15% of them, don't quote me on the number, had environmental strategies, and almost a similar percentage had strategies to look into their own greenhouse gas emissions. So clearly, we've got a complete sort of splitting up of the world into the private sector thinking about, yes, profit making, but we're not thinking about all of these factors, and we're definitely not thinking about food loss and waste. And then my last comment is, in the most recent rural development report that we also brought out, we found that the overall, and this again was brought out by the Dasgupta Biodiversity Review as well, the value of food that we produce today is $10 trillion. The price of it in the market is $8 trillion. There's $2 trillion that essentially gets lost because we're not paying attention to food loss and waste, social equity, environmental sustainability. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Because these farmers all over the world, and particularly the smallholder farmers, are really at the crux of this, demand and imperative for all of us that, we're depending on them to nourish the planet, but then also through their actions to preserve and protect and restore the planet from their actions. And so, Catherine, any kind of thoughts on this and the situation of the farmers, showing us, leading the way?
I want to think about it for a minute from a U.S. domestic perspective with small farmers. There's a reporter, he's here at the conference, Jerry Hagstrom, who's done an article recently about a couple, a man and woman from Cortland County, a county of under 50,000 in upstate New York.
Where you're from?
Yes, where I'm from.
Yay. So local stories, that's good.
And he is a fascinating article, worth finding in National Journal. He wrote the column in National Journal. And they talked about their passion for growing vegetables and having them be available in the local market. And they're doing everything possible to try to make them available in the local market, but one way that they look into is trying to find people who would buy them in bulk, like, for instance, institutions, like schools, for instance. They end up finding no problem shipping their goods to New York City to fancy restaurants, but they have a really hard time finding buyers locally, aside from farmers markets and programs for the community to buy vegetables. So, for instance, they go to the schools. There's a local buyer for the school lunch program. Well, first of all, she's got all sorts of regulations from the federal government about what you can buy. This is not necessarily bad, but one of them is buy the cheapest possible. Well, the cheapest possible sometimes is from California, not from an upstate New York county, for instance. So, but what is the real cost of food? Because, and this is one of the things Rockefeller Foundation is looking into, what's the real cost of food? Because what about the cost of the transport for all? I mean, it's built into the cost. You're going to pay for those carrots in Cortland County, but still, what is the cost to the environment, for instance, of that? And how do we build that into the national rules about what's good for school lunches? Well, another thing is the vegetable farmer doesn't process his or her food. So the school lunch ladies don't really want to chop carrots. Well, would it be worth buying a carrot chopper for $100 or however much it costs so that you could buy locally? Would that be a reasonable investment to do? So there's a whole lot of issues around how the rest of us handle the rules around what the small farmers can do. Big farmers can handle all this, but what about the small farmers? And one other example of a guy who really small farmer who raises cattle, but raising cattle means like once a year he wants to bring a cow to market. But it takes a year to make an appointment at the one place in this general rural area that has a USDA inspector there for when you process the cow.
Exactly.
So we need to think about how what the community really needs in order to push up to the federal government or the state government about what they could change to overcome the hurdles for the small farmers.
Yep, absolutely. So the potential is there for them. We see them. Angela, you were nodding your head aggressively on some of them.
Yeah.
Actively. And so a lot of these things that you're seeing, I know as well, and the barriers that are there for the small farmers in the United States of accessing all these markets, particularly schools and the competition with the bigger companies and things.
Yeah, and I was going to say, and some facilitators, I think what Catherine mentioned resonates with me, because when you look at some of the communities that lack access, local in developing local markets is critical. How do you connect? Of course, we think about cities, and I've worked mostly in cities, but our extension system, I work at Cornell Cooperative Extension, just how important it is to help facilitate some of these connections. Also the development of food policy councils, developing a community infrastructure. I'm part of a coalition that's run by CSPI, which is looking at food access within food access for incarcerated populations. And so a big focus on thinking about, in addition to schools and other places, our prisons and jails, our incarceral settings are also a place where a market can be expanded. There's farm to institution across the board, farm to child care, farm to schools, farm to incarceral settings. And so how do we break down those barriers? And some of it is policies that exist, but there's so much innovation happening right now with technology, but we just need more support in a community infrastructure to help move that forward. I think there have been some innovative approaches. Here in Chicago, where I'm located, the school district, they put some modifications in place to help buy locally, and also some specifications to ensure the food was healthier, but for some of those small vendors to be able to have an opportunity. And that is really an equity issue, because small vendors of color, small farmers of color, also, when we think about getting into some of those markets, institutional purchasing can really make the difference in economic viability. The other movement, the good food purchasing policies that are happening all over the country. Chicago also is one, Cook County, where they passed a policy to align with the good food purchasing standards within government procurement. And so I think all of those, in addition to our Food Policy Council here in Chicago, played a big role in that. So how do we sort of mobilize and develop more of a community infrastructure to support those small farmers and ensuring that they have those local markets?
Yeah, thank you, Angela, and thanks for mentioning the kind of the roles of schools and school districts in this, and also to kind of the university system. And so I've really come to appreciate that much more now that I'm in Auburn University, and what the Hunger Solutions Institute at the Auburn University is doing in a number of these programs in the communities, making sure that the federal programs then are actually implemented, the distribution, working with small wholesalers or small grocery stores as well. It's quite fascinating. Lawrence, you've been taking notes, so I'm sure there's something to say from that. And then Tom, any thoughts that you had, and then questions? So, Lawrence.
Writing down, what the hell am I going to say?
Yeah, no, exactly. Now you got to read them.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
my problem.
No,
right?
no.
This is my notes.
The
right?
writing is important. The reading, I don't need to read them. So I just still want to keep riffing on this thing about what does a climate lens reveal
Please.
from a nutrition perspective. And again, like Joe, we don't work with smallholder farmers as much. We work with the small medium enterprises that connect the farmers to the markets. That's our main set of key stakeholders. And working with them, you get a real not bird's eye view, a ground up view on what's working and what's not working in the policy space. And so you have a lot of credibility, I think, when you go to governments and say, look, this group of SMEs are telling me that you're doing this inadvertently. It's really curtailing what they can do and limiting what they can do. If you did this, it would really help them. And I think the thing that I want to come back to three things, really. One is, I think in this shock-prone world that we are living in, which we really are, I mean, there's going to be many, many more shocks because climate change is, becoming louder and louder and thumping the table louder and louder and making everything on the table jump up and down. I think diversification is going to be a really big theme for the next 10 years. Diversification of what we grow, where we grow it, how we grow it, who grows it, what energy sources we use, how much attention we pay to biodiversity, and diversity is a given. So there's all these different forms of diversity because that's one of the best ways of ensuring against shocks. So one insight that we get from our working with our small and medium enterprises is that they don't have the capacity to diversify. And we want them to be bigger players, right? Because we don't want the food industry in their economies to become more and more concentrated. We want a nice, diverse ecosystem of food suppliers, especially to low-income consumers who rely mostly on those SMEs for food. So they don't have the capacity to ride out shocks. They don't have operating capital that bigger companies do. They don't get access to the finance that they need. They're too big for microfinance, too small for formal finance. So we're working quite hard to set up this blended impact fund to get them the kind of funding they need. Not because our impact fund is going to be so massive, it's going to be tiny, 50, 60 million. But we want it as a proof of concept for the DFIs, the development finance institutions, who are incredibly risk averse and should be playing a much bigger role in being less risk averse so they can help de-risk the world for these SMEs. Second thing is around true value of food. Catherine mentioned it. When you bring climate into the nutrition space, you very quickly see that these are two bedfellows that really should go together because they are both suffering from the non-capture of costs, the externalities. So we see with SMEs that say, I'm trying to do the right thing here. I'm trying to produce healthy food that has got a lower environmental footprint, but I'm not getting any benefit from it in the market compared to someone who's producing junk food that is incredibly resource intensive. I'm not getting any benefit. So we really have to, those of you who know the movie The Matrix, you'll know that it's about a dystopian future where you can either choose to see the reality or you can choose ignorance is bliss. And the protagonist is offered the red pill or the blue pill. The blue pill is, let's just pretend everything's fine, but eventually it's going to catch up to us. Or let's get the red pill to see the reality and then we can actually do something about it. I think we've all been taking the blue pill when it comes to the way foods are priced. It's no surprise to me that we're in this situation where we're generating so many negative environmental and health externalities because we price our food to generate those, actually. It's very difficult to move away from that, but the state government of New York is trying to do this by purchasing food for its schools that incorporates some true value of food components. There are retailers in the Netherlands that show their consumers the prices of the true value of food and the retail price, and they don't make the consumers pay the true value of food. They'd probably be broke within a week, but they at least show the consumers the difference between the two, and some of them may be motivated. And my final point is really raised by something Joe said. On the World Benchmarking Alliance, is 20% of those 350 companies are sufficient. And it's really not great, it's sufficient on nutrition. When you engage with climate from a nutrition perspective, you quickly come into the ESG standards, all right, environmental, social governance standards, that are a signpost for investors to invest in certain companies. If you're an investor with a social purpose, you'll look to those ESG standards to say, well, which companies are doing well and which are not. But if you look at the health component of ESG standards, they're really, it's in there, but it's really all about product recall and product liability. Is this product going to blow up? You know, is it going to cause you severe damage? There's nothing really about health promotion and nutrition. So again, we are working with B Corp, which does a lot of this certification of companies to try to build in nutrition. But we wouldn't have done that work unless we'd come into contact with the climate partners who said ESG is the thing that helps us channel private funding into the right climate things.
Good, thank you. It's Tom. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'll just make a couple of points. I think, you know, when we think about the crops themselves and the genetics, it's very scalable, and the technologies that we're talking about work well on small farms and they work well on big farms. It's, you know, seeds translate well. Challenge is that the way that we've set up our innovation systems, they're not so scalable. We've created barriers to small scale innovation so that all the innovation targets the big scale needs rather than the small scale needs. And, you know, I think I was really pleased to see after about 20 years that the purple high anthocyanin genetically modified tomato was approved by the USDA. It was made 20 years ago. During those 20 years, probably, I don't know, 150 new types of Oreos were approved or came onto our shelves. So, you know, these healthy foods are competing with all of this variation that's brought into the CPG space, and the amount of innovation that we allow to come into food is really low. So, you know, whether it's for bigger companies to do it or smaller, in some of as gene editing is becoming a new tool for breeders to use, the countries that have the lowest barriers to use of it, so some of the South American countries, have many more things that are being done. So lots of things coming out of universities, as well as small companies, and not just big companies doing it. So I think Argentina is leading the way. I don't have the number in my head of the number of things that have been done there, but it's more that have been done in North America, because they have very straightforward rules of basically just demonstrating safety like you would with a breeding product. If it's something you can make through breeding, we regulate the products, not the process. And that's really driving innovation, and it drives it now to the small farm level. So maybe the farmer in New York will get some of the same advantages as the farmer in California, so you can have that locally produced variety.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I mean, it's all about making sure that nutrition is at the kind of center point of all of this, so that people are always thinking about that. And then, the impact of climate change, but then the accessibility, the affordability, the acceptability of all these things to consumers as well that you're talking about. So we're probably running some close to time. I've heard the next group applauding somebody, either because they were over or somebody said something brilliant. We'd be constantly applauding if that was the case here. There's been so much wisdom here. Just wanted to shout out, so any questions, but just wanted to say, so another laureate is here, maybe a couple more, Howdy, and kind of all the work that you've done on biofortification, and, bringing higher nutrient value to a lot of the staple crops in the world, and the people that are, severely deficient of all of that. So thank you for that. So just wanted to say that Howdy is also in our presence on all of this. Any questions? Yes.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Jason Nickerson. My question is about what you guys have learned about consumer preference and willingness to pay for biofortified crops in the case of developing market contexts, and high-value crops in more developed market contexts that, Tom, you're working in.
Good, thank you. I was going to get, that's a good point. So consumer preferences, anybody?
I can give you a couple of examples. I mentioned the salad that we're going to be launching next year. We we spent some time this summer providing free samples of it at some fairs, and we did one in Seattle, one in Palo Alto, one in Austin. We had more than 6,000 people. We were advertising that it was gene edited. More than 6,000 people ate the salads. Less than 1% of people said, I don't want to eat the technology. Most of them weren't because of gene editing, it was because it wasn't organic. So they wanted something that was organic. And those who ate it, 91% of them had a high willingness to want it. Many of them wanted to buy it right then. We didn't have it available to sell, but very, very high willingness to adopt the technology, and they really liked it.
Yeah, thank you. Angela, you've done work on consumer behavior?
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting. I'm really interested in learning more about the mustard green. Actually, mustard greens are part of many traditional diets, and I'm curious about the marketing as it relates to that. But I know that's sort of a separate. I have done a lot of work on consumer behavior in looking at what types of things can be motivators to get people to eat healthier, and some of those disincentives, honestly. And some of the larger companies offer a lot of disincentives, and we do need to figure out what will be that motivator for companies to not also market unhealthy products, not only producing unhealthy products, but there's been several studies about, particularly, again, I have the lens of equity of how those unhealthy products are marketed towards low-income consumers, and then also people of color, and significantly, where you see 6 times more ads for fast food, as well as sugar-sweetened beverages. So I think it's really important when we think about consumer behavior is that we can't just think about individual motivators. We also have to think about those contextual factors, including food marketing within that, because consumer preferences are not only, we used to think, oh, you're going to do what your mother did, that they were passed through families. But we now know that there's a lot of external factors that can shape what people think about products, as how they engage with products, the values that they have of those products. And a lot of that is in branding and marketing and availability, honestly, and affordability.
Good. Thank you, Angela. And I know kind of on the consumer preferences, so anybody who wants to talk to Howdy about that as well, they've kind of looked into that over the years as well. So Dan, one final question, then I know you all have other schedules and things to go to, probably the panelists as well. So Dan, yeah, quick.
Hi.
If it's possible.
I just had a thought, and it requires maybe just a quick answer. You all remember that Gus Schumacher came up with this idea for Wholesome Wave to create prescriptions from doctors in order to allow people who could not afford nutritious food to use it as a basis for doing so. It's a wonderful idea. Is it gimmicky? Does it have practical value? Is it scalable? Should we be talking about it? Should somebody do something more about this?
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, that's one of the things that say at Auburn is implementing in the state of Alabama, the GusNIP program, double up bucks, where if you buy, $10 worth of vegetables at a farmer's market, then it goes up to 20 that the consumer gets, only pays, say, the 10, but they get the double.
Who pays the other $10?
It's a federal program through kind of GusNIP, through the Gus Schumacher. But yeah, so that's a program in the U.S., but also may have, kind of international implications for that as well. So Catherine.
Yeah, well, the White House Conference, and Angela can talk about this, but the White House Conference put a high priority on food as medicine. Food is medicine.
Food is medicine, right.
And on this whole idea that Gus did pilot a long time ago. So yeah, it's becoming a real thing. And I know, again, in our little county, we use this. The doctors have to be trained about it, actually.
Right. Yeah, doctors receive when doing the first 1,000 Days book, learned from a number of doctors that, yeah, in all their years of medical training, to do what they do, they might have maybe 15 minutes, perhaps a half an hour of nutritional
That's one of the things we
education.
put
It's
in-
shocking,
That's
right?
one of the things we put in the Chicago Council report, that
Yes.
there should be training for doctors in school before they get out on
Yeah,
nutrition.
precisely. And Lawrence, and then Tom, I know you
Yeah,
have something to
three
say.
very quick observations. One, we don't really, in the public sector, we don't really know much about consumer insights. Why? We don't do much research on consumer insights. We do a lot of research on what do people buy, and we do research from an economics perspective on how does price and convenience play into that. But we don't do any research on the emotional drivers that cause people to buy food, that the private sector is just so brilliant at manipulating, really, sort of the right brain stuff about aspiration and emotion and making you feel like you absolutely have to buy this even though you didn't even know about it and you probably don't need it. That's first observation. Second observation, again, we're really finding that it's not enough to promote the good foods. You have to begin to curtail the unhealthy foods. So in our behavior change work in Indonesia, in Indonesian villages, community health centers, we get junk food that's easily available near the communities, cheese puff kind of stuff, you know, shiny packages, it tastes great, looks good. You dissolve it in some water and you see the odor that's given off. The mothers see the odor that's given off. They see the oily slick that forms in the water, and they are literally repulsed by this. And it's very important to get emotions in play, not just for the good stuff, but for the bad stuff. And the third thing, going back to what does climate bring to nutrition and vice versa, we're experimenting with food labels that are simple and that have health information on them and climate information on them as well. And it could be too complicated, and it could actually make things worse, but we're trying.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I was at a healthcare conference last week, and one of the big topics is value-based healthcare. So it's sort of similar to, I think, what Lawrence is talking about paying for the quality of the food and not just what they charge you. So there's a lot of movement towards, it's a small movement still, but a lot of movement towards reimbursement based on the outcome. And that's causing insurance companies, therefore, to support people getting a healthy meals to keep them from going back to the hospital and other things like that.
Yep.
Which is, I think, a whole business that we're going to see developing.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. I was going to mention that, Dan, that insurance companies are starting to get into this as kind of the preventative medicine or the preventative cost of things. And then, you know, just programs of, you know, like wellness programs where there's pediatricians, doctors in communities. I know in Auburn, in Alabama, that, yeah, there are programs where they then work with local farmers. And when they are seeing cases of poor nutrition, one way or the other, just if you're prescribing, you know, some medicine, we'll also kind of prescribe a basket of vegetables and fruits that then also go to the clients as well. So, yeah.
Just quickly, on the insurance programs, they're a bit problematic. They sound like a really good idea. When you work it through, it's the higher income people who are able to take advantage of it.
Well, yeah.
I think that's
Not always.
not always, no, but it can happen. So you've got to
Yeah.
design it really well.
So there's all these, guardrails that need to. Joe is wanting to say.
Very quickly, so riffing off of what Angela was talking about and also Lawrence and Tom, one, clearly context becomes really important. So when, for example, you introduce double fortified salt, and this was done in India, so iodine with iron, so double fortified salt was introduced by one of the largest food and beverage companies in India. It was a huge failure, and it's primarily because salt fortified with iron turns brown, and it makes your food colored brown. So even though it's much more nutritious, it was essentially then called off of all of the shelves because of the cultural context of it. And there are so many examples of this. I know everyone on this panel can talk about them. But even when we're talking about efficient cook stoves, one of the biggest failures with efficient cook stoves when they were introduced in West and Central Africa was that changed the flavor of your food. And so 6 months later, a very successful program for the first 3 months. 6 months later, adoption rates had essentially gone down to 50%. And by the end of the year, essentially you had 18% adoption. So I think, really knowing as to what is the context within which we are introducing all of this becomes really key. And then the last point that I wanted to make was a call for evidence. We were looking, I wanted to understand, well, what are the drivers, causal drivers of obesity that we can find in developing countries? And we wanted to do a systematic review. And we did an evidence map. It was almost a null evidence map. Obesity in obesity in developing parts of the world, mainly because it's focused on urban areas, and we found almost no evidence to tell us as to what can be the driver. So please, can we have better evidence? Thank you.
Yeah, please, I will emphasize that. I second the motion also as a journalist. Please evidence the data and in the stories that go with it. I often tell people, don't get me started on this because I can go on. It's the same for everybody up here and all our panelists. So this has been great. We'll move on. Angela, out there in the internet world, any final words as we wrap up here?
I just would like to pick up on Joe's point about evidence. What Joe mentioned is critical. What GusNIP, for example, Gretchen Swanson Center runs the national evaluation of the GusNIP program, and they published a report last year about how effective, the program is, how it impacts intake. And I think the more evidence that we have on understanding the drivers, as well as evaluations of what happens when these programs are implemented within community, that's critically important. The sort of addition to that I will briefly discuss is that when we develop those metrics and measures, local folks have to be at the table for what those measures are, or we will get, what we've gotten in the past, particularly in the US, that really these programs are not going to resonate with people, and we don't really see mass and population change and improvements in health. People have to be at the table in communities on developing metrics and indicators of success. And so I'll close there. And thank you so much again for inviting me to be part of the panel.
Well, thank you, Angela. Thanks everybody on the panel for joining us. Thanks for all of you. You chose wisely, as I said, so thank you.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Roger.
Thank you, Roger.